Welcome, everyone, to Week 2 of EEI's 5th Annual Global Electrification Forum, or GEF. If you are just joining us today, my name is Vanessa Ferrero, and I'm a Manager for International Programs at EEI. I'll be your MC throughout the GEF. Today's sessions are all about energy, climate change, and future generations. As we begin, we'd like to welcome EEI President Tom Kuhn, who will give some opening remarks for Week 2 of the GEF. Without further ado, please welcome Tom to the stage.
Hello and welcome back to EEI's 5th Annual Global Electrification Forum. I am delighted to help kick off this second week of an exciting 2-week program of panel sessions, keynotes, executive roundtables, an innovation showcase, and fireside chats. Once again, I would like to congratulate Lawrence Jones and the EEI International Programs team, who have put together this outstanding series of discussions that is bringing together such an impressive group of CEOs from some of the world's leading electric companies, as well as leaders from finance, government, and philanthropy. For those of you who were not able to join us last week, I am excited to reintroduce the theme of this year's GEF, Destination 2050, Inflection, Pathways, Crossroads, and Convergence. What an appropriate title. This week is Earth Week, and Thursday is Earth Day, and I am proud that EEI's member companies here in the United States, as well as our international member companies around the world, are leading a profound energy transformation and building an energy future that is cleaner, smarter, and stronger for all customers. Through meetings like the GEF, we are excited to help drive the global dialogue on how electricity and the world's electric power sector is an important part of the solution to so many global challenges, from addressing climate change and reaching a 100% clean energy future to fighting poverty and all forms of injustice and inequality. I am proud that EEI has helped to build deep and strong relationships with many global energy partners. Once again, I would like to thank the many participants around the world, our speakers, moderators, the members of the International Programs, Regional Advisory Committees, and our global ambassadors. Last week, the GEF addressed topics that included navigating radical uncertainty, thriving in a post-pandemic world, electrifying transportation industry and whole economies, enabling the clean energy future, transformational change, and digitalization. Thanks again to all our outstanding speakers, including the CEOs of 15 U.S. and international EEI member companies. We also heard thought-provoking insights from Lord Mervyn King, former governor of the Bank of England, and from Dr. Daniel Yergin, co-founder of IHS Markit and Pulitzer Prize-winning author. As part of the GEF, we hosted the Asian Pacific Executive Roundtable and had robust dialogue on that region's pathways and the challenges and opportunities of reaching their net zero carbon goals. It was a terrific dialogue. Time does not permit me to mention all our great speakers that we will hear from this week. We will kick off week 2 today with a conversation between Roman Krznaric, author of the Good Ancestor, and Lawrence. This will be followed by an intergenerational roundtable with Dr. Hamadoun Touré, the Minister of Information Technology and Digital Economy for the government of the Republic of Mali, and Ambassador Thomas Christensen, the Climate Ambassador of Denmark, and other distinguished panelists. We will also have panels on the customer, business, and regulatory models, resilience, and leadership. We are looking forward to hearing from Malcolm Turnbull, the 29th Prime Minister of Australia, and Dr. Rod Carr, Chairperson of the Climate Change Commission of New Zealand, on Wednesday. On Earth Day, I am excited to be participating in a conversation with Alan Schwartz, the Executive Chairman of Guggenheim Partners, followed by special remarks from Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales. Following that, I look forward to a panel on realizing net zero ambitions with speakers including Andrew Steer, the new president CEO of Bezos Earth Fund. I should note that when Lawrence and his team planned our Earth Day session last December, they did not know that it would coincide with President Biden's International Climate Summit, which will kick off on Thursday. I'm looking forward to the Transatlantic Executive Roundtable on Net Zero that we are organizing in collaboration with Euroelectric. This important dialogue will convene electric company CEOs from the United States, Canada, and Europe. Finally, I want to say thanks to all our sponsors, Guidehouse, Black & Veatch, ICF, Amply Power, and our media partners, Electric Perspectives, Public Utilities Fortnightly, the Energy Industry Times, and our other partners, Bolons and the American Council on Capital Formation. Once again, thank you, everyone. Lawrence, back to you.
Thank you, Tom, for those very, very kind introduction of this week's session. And ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to just take a few minutes to do what we would normally do at the Jeff if we were in person. As I like to say, behind every successful international activity we do, there is an army of people that you don't normally see. Again, when we're out in the field representing EEI, we want to do this successfully because of the work of all of the individuals behind us, our partners, our co-workers at EEI in different departments who make this possible. So while we may be the face of EEI out in the world, without them, we will not be successful. And so today we would like to recognize them and call their names out because of the work that they do. We'd first like to extend thanks to our global ambassadors. Thank you to them, Lamin Savadogo, Pierre Bernard, and Ian McLeod. These individuals make our lives easier because they represent EEI on an international stage, helping us to do what we do in a way that makes us successful. So thanks to our global ambassadors. We would also like to express our thanks to our co-workers from the different departments who actually have been an instrumental force in us being successful throughout these years when we've had the Jeff. So thanks to all across EEI, from the IT department, from the communications department, from the member relations department, from the meeting services department, legal and accounting, and speaker outreach. You can see the names of all of our co-workers at EEI, and it's because of them that we were able to organize this Jeff. And even as I speak, many of them are behind the scenes making sure things work the way they should. Now, finally, I'd like to introduce to you our international program team. First, Kimberly Mitchell. Kimberly is our coordinator and executive assistant with the international program. Next is Alikia Olivarapu. She is an analyst with EEI International Program. And then last but not least, the master of ceremony of the Jeff, Vanessa Ferrero, who is a manager with EEI International Program. So ladies and gentlemen, when we are successful, it's because of these individuals on the screen and the ones I mentioned, as well as our global ambassadors. So with that, I say thank you and hand it back over to Vanessa.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you to all of you for joining us and participating throughout the Jeff. We hope you've been enjoying our programming so far. Now, I would like to introduce our opening keynote session for week 2 of the Jeff. Our distinguished speaker is Dr. Roman Krznaric, a public philosopher and author of the book, The Good Ancestor, a radical prescription for long-term thinking. As we continue to envision the energy systems of 2050, we will need to ensure that our energy transitions are equitable and just, not only across geographies, but across generations. With this being the start of Earth Week, we thought it would be fitting to have Roman share some of his wisdom for how we can be good ancestors for the generations to come. Roman will be joined in conversation by EEI Vice President for International Programs, Dr. Lawrence Jones. Without further ado, please welcome Roman and Lawrence to the stage.
Hello, Roman.
Hi there, Lawrence. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Nice to see you. And finally, we made this work after months of trying.
Well, I'm really looking forward to the conversation and seeing where it takes us.
Well, absolutely here. So great. So Roman, we could not be having this conversation at a more important time. Obviously, this week, as you heard from Tom Kuhn's introduction, the World Climate Summit being held in Washington, D.C., hosted by President Joe Biden. Obviously, we have a series of events here at EEI as part of the Global Electrification Forum, really focusing on climate change and other related issues. But let's get to the book. Now, by the way, Roman, just so you know, I actually kept all my sticky notes in the book. So you're on mute. So normally what I would do is I would go ahead and sort of hide these, but I wanted you to see these because this is a fascinating book. Congratulations. Now, before this, you had Carpe Diem, you had Empathy, you had also Wonderbox. How did you get to Good Ancestor, and why this book?
So The Good Ancestor is a book really about long-term thinking. How do we get over the incredible short-termism that we know that we're trapped in? And on some level, it's a book about how do we really step into the shoes of future generations? In other words, how do we kind of empathize with them? How do we see the world from their perspective? And I really came to that topic through my other books. Some of those other books you mentioned, like my book on empathy, was about how do we step into the shoes of people in today's world who are voiceless, powerless, marginalized. They might be living on the streets in a wealthy country, or living in a favela in Rio. But in my previous books, I'd never really tackled this issue of how do we connect with those future people? Because if you think about it, okay, there are 7.7 billion of us alive today, but over the next couple of centuries, tens of billions of people will be born, and they don't have any political rights or representation. They have no influence in the marketplace, yet our actions affect them like at no point in history. And I really felt that this was a topic I needed to tackle for exactly the reasons that we're here today, which is, and President Biden's climate summit, which is that so many of our challenges this century are really about long-term thinking. It's not just about planning for the next pandemic that might be on the horizon, or planning for the impacts of new technologies, whether it's threats from artificial intelligence or bioweapons, but we also have the ecological crisis, of course. We need to be thinking not about the here and now, but thinking years, decades, even further in the future. So that's really where that's the sort of starting point for this book, as it were. You're on mute, Lawrence.
I hate this, right? So, so what I find interesting about the book is the number of examples you use, and also for a book of this character, you seem to ask a lot of questions along the way in the book, which I thought was very interesting. And one of the questions you raised in the book right at the outset is, why are we trapped in this sort of a short-termism? Why has it been the modus operandi for us? How can we get away from this short-termism?
Yeah, I think, we all realize that we live in an incredibly short-term world. I mean, the former, the current chief economist of the Bank of England, Andy Haldanes, talked about the chronic myopia in the corporate world, for example. And I think we often associate short-termism with things that are around here and now today. People constantly looking at their phones on average 110 times a day, or the short-termism of the markets, the nanosecond speed share trading. But actually in my book, I delve a bit deeper than that and look at 6 different drivers of short-termism in human history. Of course, there are those ones that we know about, like digital distraction and speculative capitalism, but there are deeper ones. So for example, I write about what I call the tyranny of the clock. The way that clock time has been speeding up since the medieval period, when we first invented mechanical clocks, where clocks originally just measured every hour, but by 1700, most clocks had minute hands. By 1800, they had second hands. And of course, that's been ratcheted up faster and faster, keeping the assembly line moving. And now we've got that nanosecond speed share trading. But then we've also got drivers of short-termism, crucially in the political world. Things that President Biden is dealing with every day. And, Malcolm, Turnbull, the former Australian Prime Minister, who's part of this event too, which is that politicians find it very difficult to see beyond the next election, or even the latest headline or opinion poll or tweet. And even if they want to, they feel the pressures. And if you're going to be making long-term public policy, well, you can't just look 2 or 4 years ahead to the next congressional election. Somehow we need to kind of leapfrog that. And that's a real short-term driver of political presentism that's really difficult to tackle.
So that was for the politicians. But before we go further, and I want us to talk about the 6 ways to think long-term, which you do talk about in the book, and to get your views. But set aside politicians. What about the average citizen? I mean, in the book, you talk about Marshmallow Brain and the Acorn Brain. What's up with us? I mean, we are also part of the system. So why are we all stuck in this world of thinking short term?
Yeah, that's a really fundamental question, because I think we have a narrative in society that we're basically short-term creatures. We're driven by instant rewards and immediate gratification. If you study economics, this is the sort of thing you talk about. And in my book, as you mentioned there, I talk about what's called I call the marshmallow brain. There's my little marshmallow. This is the part of our brain which focuses on instant gratification, short-term rewards, and that's a real part of us. But it's part of our ancient mammalian brain going back to 80 million years. But alongside the marshmallow brain, which of course is named after the famous marshmallow test, that psychology experiment in the 60s, where little kids had a marshmallow put in front of them. If they could resist eating it for 15 minutes, they were rewarded with a second marshmallow, but the majority couldn't resist and snatched the snack. But that isn't the whole story of who we are, because we also have in our brains what I call the acorn brain. There's my acorn. And this is the part of our brains, our neural wiring, which is all about long-term thinking and planning and strategizing. And it's better developed in humans than most other creatures. So a chimpanzee will plan ahead a little bit. They'll get a stick, strip off the leaves to turn into a tool to poke in a termite hole. But they'll never make a dozen of those tools and set them aside for next week. But that is exactly what a human being will do, right? That's our acorn brain in action. It's the acorn brain that enables us to save for our pensions or our kids' education. It's enabled what I call in the book cathedral thinking, which I'm sure we'll talk about more. The idea of embarking on long-term projects like building the Great Wall of China or voyaging into space. And it's the acorn brain in a way that we need to tap into more and find ways of switching on. And I think this is a very fundamental part of who we are, as well as the marshmallow brain. And there's this, there's a constant struggle going on. That's real. Do I party tonight or save for my pension for tomorrow? Do I upgrade to the latest iPhone or plant a seed in the ground for posterity? And what we need to do is calibrate our economic, political, cultural institutions. So we're using that acorn brain capacity, which we have, which we're certainly not using nearly enough to deal with the climate emergency, for instance.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny you hinted to cathedral thinking, and I want us to talk about these 6 ways of long-term thinking, and specifically, Roman, if you can, maybe out of the 6, knowing what you know about the energy industry, you may want to sort of identify which ones you think might be critical. And personally, I like the cathedral thinking, because the first time I heard the phrase was actually used by a former chairman of EEI. He's deceased now, Jim Rogers. And when Jim talked about cathedral thinking, it stuck with me all these years. So walk us through these 6 ways of long-term thinking from your perspective. Which ones we need to look at from an industry that now, the energy industry and climate change? Which ones we need for the next 100 years, if you may, from our perspective?
Yeah, actually, if I was going to pick up one out of the 6 to start with, it definitely would be cathedral thinking. And I guess the reason partly is because, throughout human history, humans have had this capacity to particularly build things for the long term. I mean, think of the medieval cathedrals, where those who embarked on building them started knowing they'd never be finished within their own lifetimes. And Greta Thunberg's famously said, we need cathedral thinking to deal with the climate crisis. And so this is all about embarking on projects which go beyond our lifetimes, or at least our own career spans. But cathedral thinking comes in very different varieties. And I think it's useful to try and sort of break it down a little bit, so it becomes a bit more useful when trying to think about energy and its futures. So I think one kind of cathedral thinking is projects which do take a long time to complete. So the classic example would be a cathedral like Ulm Minster in southwest Germany was begun in 1377, when the citizens of Ulm decided they wanted to have their own cathedral. Well, it wasn't finished until more than 500 years later in 1890. It's like the world's longest crowdfunding project. And of course, we've seen many other kinds of projects like that. They take a long time to finish. But then there's another set of cathedral thinking projects, which are, they may not take that long to create or build, but they're designed to last a long time once they're built or once they're created. So a good example of that would be, let's say, the sewers built in London in the 19th century. There was this famous event many people listening might know about called the Great Stink of 1858. Until that time, raw sewage was being dumped in the River Thames. And tens of thousands of people were dying each year of cholera. But the crisis was so bad in 1858, and the stench so bad, it went into the Palace of Westminster, so members of Parliament couldn't even breathe. And they finally passed the emergency legislation to build the sewers. Now, those sewers took about 18, 19 years to build, but the chief engineer, Sir Joseph Bazalgette, built them twice as big as they needed to be. Because he had this long-term vision. And that's why those sewers are still in use today, right? This was building for the long term. And I think one of the interesting things about the sewers is that Bazalgette and his team did not choose the cheapest option. I mean, they used very expensive Staffordshire bricks, 318 million of them. They used a new expensive material called Portland cement, which got harder and harder the more it connected with water. That's why they're still there today. It was expensive, but the longevity, it was worth it. So I think that's one kind of set of distinctions between things that take a long time to build and things that last a long time. But I think, and there's one more kind of other sort of binary distinction, which is really important, which has to do not with different kinds of cathedral thinking, but its advantages. You know, why would you do this? Mm-hmm. And I think one reason is to do with resilience to all sorts of threats and changes. So I think a really good example of this, thinking of energy, is the Onagawa nuclear power plant in Japan. Now, as again, many people might know that when the tsunami hit Japan in 2011, the Fukushima plant went into meltdown. It was, destroyed by the tsunami. But there was another nuclear plant even closer to the tsunami, and it was called Onagawa, and that one survived. And the question is why? In fact, it was so resilient that local villagers and townspeople even sheltered in the Onagawa plant when the tsunami came. And the reason was because in the 1970s, it's a fascinating story, the chief engineer knew that tsunamis hit that area. He had studied history going back 1,000 years. In the 9th century, a local temple had been destroyed by a tsunami 7 miles inland. So what he did is he built a wall 15 meters high and then put the plant itself another 15 meters high, way beyond what regulations required. So he argued like crazy with the board, and he got his way. And partly because of the governance structures allowed him to have a voice, he was able to create something that was resilient, and I think that's a really good example. So that's resilience for cathedral thinking, for resilience. And then I'll just give one more example, which is another advantage of cathedral thinking as I see it, which is adaptability to changing circumstances. And I think a good energy example is one, again, people will be familiar with, which is what used to be called Dong Energy, the Danish oil and natural gas company, now called Ørsted. And as you know, Lawrence, back in 2009, I think it was, the CEO of Dong decided to embark on what he called their 85-15 vision. So switching from 85% fossil fueled and 15% renewable to turn that around. Yeah. And the idea was to try and do that within a generation, 30 years, they said. Well, they actually achieved it within 10 years. And by 2017, Dong changed its name to Ørsted. And I think you might be having someone from Ørsted coming along in the next few days. And, Ørsted now controls 30% of the world's offshore wind power market. Right now, that was adapting to change, and that was brilliant cathedral thinking. It wasn't easy, and the reason I like Dong as an example was they had huge fights, internally and with politicians because it's part state owned in order to achieve that. But it was worth it for the adaptability advantages that came out of it.
As a matter of fact, Roman, we actually had the CEO of Dong Energy here on Wednesday, and he was part of a panel we did that discussed some of the very things you talked about. I want to move on now, and in the context of cathedral thinking, talk about building projects, physical things, right? I want to talk about cathedral thinking in the context of ideas, because that's where policy making occurred, right? Policy making is all about ideas, right? So how do we make sure that the policies being put in place today are designed through the lens of cathedral thinking, so that we can actually have sort of a long-term perspectives on how the world is going to evolve? What advice would you give to the group of 40 leaders who will be meeting with President Biden this Thursday? How would they apply cathedral thinking to be able to make the world a better place?
It's a really good and a really tough question, because I think there's, let's say, a set of political and economic changes one might ask for. And I think it all depends on the country you're in and the context you're in. So let's just look to the politics, for example, because clearly we need mechanisms to think beyond the here and now and to enable policy decision makers to think beyond the here and now. So in Wales, for example, they have a public position called the Future Generations Commissioner. So they have a commissioner, a public position, which is it's not a party political appointment. It's a sort of just a public body appointment. And the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales doesn't have a lot of power, but has a kind of soft power in order to look at the impacts of public policy up to 30 years ahead. So that might be impact on environmental, energy, transport, all sorts of areas. That's one kind of thing one might use or draw upon. And also in the political realm, one might draw upon legal changes as well. There's a very recent, in fact, in the last week in Pakistan, there was a Supreme Court ruling against the cement industry. And the Supreme Court ruled that the cement industry was violating the rights of future generations of Pakistani citizens, right? So there's and it's a really amazing ruling, and it talks about the language of intergenerational justice. There's a real shift going on in the legal sphere in many, many countries. So there's that kind of thing. I think in the sort of more directly economic realm, if I was there with Biden and his fellow leaders, I think there's certain things that can extend the time horizons of business, which are important. Things like carbon disclosure requirements for companies to publish their exposure to climate risk and, their carbon footprints and ecological footprints. I think that would start changing the markets, and maybe not very, very fast, but that's important. I think you could do many more radical things than that as well to introduce more long-termism into decision-making. So again, on the governmental level, I've seen, some really interesting discussions recently about taxing short-term share trades in a progressive way. Let's say if you hold a share for a day, you're taxed at 10% on it. But if you hold it for, a year, maybe it's 5%. If you hold it for 10 years, there's no tax on it. And that kind of thing hasn't yet been introduced really, though in France, actually, there is a special tax on algorithmic share trades that are under half a second, right? And I don't think it's hugely effective yet, but that's the kind of thing that's happening in France also. This is really interesting. If you hold shares for more than 2 years, you double your voting rights. So it's giving more weight towards long-term capital investment. And I think these kind of regulatory changes can start changing let's say, the financial ecosystem, pushing it towards a little bit long term. I mean, what do you think in your view, Lawrence? I mean, you know so much more about the energy sector than me. What would you be saying?
It's kind of funny you brought it back to me. I was just going to make one other example, and that's New Zealand, where now the rights of rivers. So they're treating rivers as a sort of a citizens with rights, and so if you pollute the river, you can be sued for doing that, right? But coming back to your question regarding our industry, I just got a question from the audience here, by the way, which says electric utilities have now many oversight agencies for good reasons, do operationally, perhaps not always. And the question is, what do you tell them so utilities can exercise cathedral thinking or cathedral planning? It's an interesting concept. How do you plan for the long term? So I think I'll answer your question by asking you that question on behalf of the industry.
Well, I am just a philosopher in a room in a study in Oxford and no great expert on the intricacies of the energy utilities. What does come to mind, actually, first thing comes to mind was a conversation I was involved in just a few weeks ago with the head of the United Nations Development Program, Akam Steiner, and we were talking about the problems that UN agencies are facing around having long-term goals around long-term investment in education and healthcare, for example. That's what they want to do, but their budgetary cycles are incredibly short-term, 3 years, 5 years. If your budget cycles are so short, it's going to be very hard to do long-term planning and long-term investment. So I think that's one thing I would pinpoint when it comes to oversight agencies, how their own budgetary cycles work. Again, I don't know, how these things operate, and I think this is probably more on the level of individual companies, which is different. But I think, of course, when you talk to leaders in business, many of people listening today, what is it that creates short-termism? Well, one of the things is the incentive structures that employees have, both at the upper executive level, but also middle managers. And when they're incentivized to hit short-term performance financial targets, whether it's profit, market share, revenues, that holy trinity, and those short-term cycles of quarterly reporting that everyone's obsessed with, well, that doesn't help with taking a long view. So if you can build into remuneration packages and bonuses things like getting, the incentives are built around long-term sustainability targets, which you've got in companies like Siemens and Shell and others, that starts shifting the culture. Now, I'm not sure a regulator can start imposing that kind of thing, but I think there's that capacity for sort of cathedral thinking through changing incentives. I mean, what comes to your mind in that area?
I think what's happening in our industry is that you now have an industry where cathedral thinking was almost something they did because most of the assets, most of the infrastructure were designed and built to last for 50 years, right? What has happened because of digitalization, you now have this sort of a hybrid situation where electric companies now have to both invest in, I would call, short-lived assets, like the digital asset that live for maybe 5 years when you have a new server or you have a new system up, and the transformer that's going to be there for 40, 50 years. So while the tradition of planning for the long term has been something that the utilities are very good at doing, they're now forced against the situation where they've been pressured and compared with other industries that do not have the same kind of assets. So some very successful companies in the world, like Facebook, has very little infrastructure, right? And yet and still, people are using the Facebook model, maybe the Amazon model, I guess, and apply it to the electricity sector or to the energy sector where these assets are there for the long time. That doesn't mean you shouldn't sort of rethink how you go about cathedral thinking. You certainly need to do it, but I think that's one of the challenges facing the industry. The other thing you mentioned, regulation. It's interesting because around the world, when I talk to utility executives, the challenge they're facing in the context of cathedral thinking is that many regulatory agencies are themselves confined to the political realities within which they will operate, right? So if you're a regulator who has been appointed by a certain government who's going to be there for 5 years, well, guess what? You're going to act in a certain way, I guess, to maybe make sure that you sort of stay in good graces with that government, right? I want to move on to something a little bit more personal. So you and I have one thing in common, which we discovered when we got to know each other, is that we both have twins. Your twins are older than mine, my twin boys. You have a boy and a girl. So talk about how kids influence our thinking about the future and how we can learn from kids, one. But then two, how can we teach children to start thinking long-term in a world where my 5-year-old want everything to go fast? I'm sure the same problem went for your kids too. So how do we learn from them about long-term thinking, and how do we teach them long-term thinking?
I mean, I certainly find in my own experience that my children, 12-year-old twins, teach me an enormous amount about thinking long-term. But in order to do that, I think one needs to draw on the resource of the human imagination. I mean, if you think about it, okay, if I think about my daughter, she's 12 years old. Now, I can close my eyes easily and imagine her on her 90th birthday. She could easily be alive in the year 2100. Now, for all of the uncertainties in the world and all the difficulties of predicting the future and the problems of economic modeling, actually, I believe the future is quite certain. In other words, business as usual projections, especially around ecological issues, are telling us we're heading towards 3 to 4 degrees of heating and 1 to 2 meters of sea level rises. Of course, we don't know exactly how much, but we know I know my daughter, when she's 90, if we continue with business as usual, is going to be living in a very, very different world. And at least the way I think about it is that if I think about, say, my daughter's life, as she grows older, she's not alone in the world. She's part of a web of communities and people who support her, family, friends, loved ones, but also she's part of the web of the living world, the air she breathes and the water she drinks. So if I care about her life, the logical step is I have to care about all life. I have to care about climate change. I have to care about biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, the fact that half the world's coral reefs have been destroyed in the last decade, all of that stuff, because it affects her basic livelihood. And I think one of the things I've found really fascinating since my book, The Good Ancestor, came out, and if I'm talking, say, to politicians or people in business, wherever they sit on the political spectrum, wherever they are, they all get the idea that, they all have children or grandchildren or nephews or nieces. They can all grasp the idea that those young people are going to inherit a very, very different world, and we have a responsibility, to them. And so I think we just need to give ourselves the time and the space to think about those future, generations, those young people in our lives, and not imagine that they're going to be able to be, protect themselves, or just hide behind walls. But I think on the other side of your question, what can we, how can we teach young people? I think there are real issues there, because your kids, like my kids, are looking at phones, wanting to go fast. But they're also, there's also a generation of activists, young people who are, trying to shut down coal-fired power stations and all sorts of things like that. But I think in terms of values, I think that long-term thinking needs to be taught in schools, scenario planning, intergenerational justice. In Canada, for instance, the David Suzuki Environmental Foundation has developed curriculum materials for elementary school kids where they look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has nothing in it about future generations, and they're asked to write new clauses or new articles for the Universal Declaration about the rights of future generations, both people and planet. As you were mentioning there, the struggles going on for the legal rights for rivers and mountains in India and in Aotearoa in New Zealand. And I think those kinds of teaching is really fundamental. And, it's very feasible. It's happening in many countries already. But that's a sort of a very, a classically long-term approach. If you want to change the values of a society, you change what kids are taught. That's at least a starting point.
Well, that's good. And you mentioned intergenerational. We're going to come back to that, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about your interaction with the Vatican and with other religious leaders on this whole topic of intergenerational justice, because I know the Pope has made it a big issue. He's talked about it in one of the papal writings. What has been your feeling after your interaction with him? Where do you think this movement is going now that you have people at that level looking at this idea of being good ancestors?
Yeah, it's really fascinating, actually, how, say, the Catholic Church, for instance, has picked up the language of intergenerational justice or intergenerational solidarity. So in excuse me, Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, praise be, he talks explicitly about that using that kind of language. And when I've been in the Vatican and talking with officials there, it's very much part of their thinking. And I think many religions have built into them some kind of idea of protecting the sacredness of the earth. They express it in very different ways, and they haven't always thought that, but I think it's there, some kind of idea of ecological stewardship. But equally, we can draw on indigenous cultures, in many Native American communities, Haudenosaunee, Lakota, they talk about the idea of seventh generation decision making decisions based 7 generations ahead. And in a way, when I think about leadership today, I sort of think a good leader is one who's embraced that idea of 7th generation thinking, who's looking, beyond the here and now for people and planet. And I certainly see that the Catholic Church and other religious groups are doing more and more of that. And then you're seeing that kind of thinking, interestingly, coming into new forms of political decision making. So that idea of seventh generation decision making, for example, has been adopted by a Japanese movement called Future Design, which is all about local government decision making. It's fascinating. What they do is they invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live, and they typically split them into two groups. Half are told they're residents from the present day, and half are given these kind of orange ceremonial robes to wear and told to imagine themselves as residents from 2060. And it turns out that when imagining themselves from 2060, they come up with far more transformative plans, whether it's for healthcare investment or climate change action. And this method, which is directly inspired by the Native American seventh generation idea, is now being used in big cities like Kyoto, but also in Japanese companies like Fujitsu in their sustainability planning. They're not just thinking, okay, what should our 20-year plan be or 50-year plan be? They're actually getting their employees and customers to imagine themselves in the future and giving advice to the present. And lots of companies are doing things like that, which I think are really, really interesting. Actually, it just reminds me of another a UK energy company, renewable energy company called Good Energy, has just set up a children's board, actually a board of teenagers who advise the company and the main board in a kind of shadow capacity on long-term thinking and long-term justice issues and climate change and things. So there's a lot of innovation going on.
And I think one of the points you made regarding the Vatican and other, institutions where these changes are happening, I think it's also one where on a personal level, the idea of legacy mindset, which you talk about. And I was so pleased to see in the book that you actually reference Wangari Maathai from the Green Belt movement. And in terms of legacy, I must say that a good sign that your legacy lives on is when your children either follow in your footsteps or when your children sort of listen to one of the advice you give them many, many years ago. And one idea here was that, talking about Wangari, which you may not know, her daughter is actually the Africa head of the World Resources Institute. I sit on the global board of WRI, so it was just interesting to see her here, and wanted to make that point clear for people that your legacy lives on if you do what you do, and if what you do is in the interest of society and not just yourself.
Actually, can I just say there, Lawrence, I think that's a really important point to make, because I think a lot of us, when we think about the legacy we want to leave, we might want to be, a lot of people have the sort of idea of like a Russian oligarch who wants a football stadium of a wing of a national gallery named after them. That's the legacy they'll leave, like Alexander the Great wanting statues of himself everywhere. Well, that's quite an egotistic form of legacy. I think we need to switch to something much wider than that, about the universal strangers of the future. How are those future generations going to judge us? I mean, the title of my book, The Good Ancestor, was kind of stolen in a way from a question that was asked by the great immunologist Jonas Salk, who developed the polio vaccine back in the 50s, who famously didn't patent his invention, his creation. But in the 70s, he said, look, the great question facing society is this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, how are we going to be remembered by all those generations to come, by our own children, but by people we'll never meet?
No, that's good. And talking about new thinking around the future, I want to talk about investors, because this is one group that I guess some struggle with this notion of long-term, right? You make an investment and you're like, I want the return right now. How do we get the investment community or the financial sector to maybe adjust the definition of long-term or even short-term, right? Because, you have quarterly earnings or you have earnings every year. It depends on the company you're with, right? So how do we change that? And I think before you answer the question, let me just throw in another little aspect of it. That is the societal expectations of, we all want everything instantly, right? This instant gratification. So you want your return on investment today. You want your cash, converted from stocks to cash today. Everything is about the now. Can we really change the perspective or the behavior of investors in terms of what they should expect in the long term without changing the fundamental value system that society has? Can we do that?
Big question. I love it. You know what it makes me think of, your question? The former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, recently went off to work for Brookfield Asset Management, to run their, environmental social portfolios. But he was also told by his boss to deliver double-digit returns every year. Right? Now, if you're asked to deliver 12% returns year on year, you're going to have a huge challenge meeting all those ESG goals, right? In fact, he should be asked to reduce the carbon impact of the portfolio 12% a year on year, because that's exactly what we really need to tackle the ecological crisis. And those kinds of attitudes about exactly as you say, what's expected, and what shareholders and venture capital expects and so on returns is really challenging. Though, of course, on the other hand, I mean, there are multiple different time horizons operating in different businesses. So I had a talk the other day with the founder of one of the big social media companies, and I was saying, to him, well, what does long term mean to you? And he was saying, well, I'm going to be losing, when you start a new app or some big social media thing, you're going to be losing money for at least 10 years, right? So that's a sort of a minimum sort of threshold, like Amazon or any of these companies. They're losing money for years and years and years. So the investors need to, and often do have and can have, that more patient capital attitude. But ultimately, I think that, and this comes to what you were asking at the end of your question about the changing values. Ultimately, I think we need to shift our set of values. I think the core value that we've grown up with, that we've inherited from the last century, is the idea of continual economic growth, progress. The curve is going ever upwards. This is what people like Steven Pinker and others have told us, but it's also what every government in the Western world, whether left, right, or center, has pursued since the Second World War. Growth, 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 growth. But we now know that is unsustainable. We're using 1.6 planet Earths every year. We know that there is no systematic evidence that we can decouple growth from carbon emissions or material use at anything like this, the pace and scale required. Yes, we can reduce resource intensity a little bit, but nothing like fast enough. So we need to go to a different kind of economic model. And in fact, I happen to have it right here on a stick, right? I can show you. This is one of the economic models, which I think is particularly helpful for rethinking our values and for businesses. And it's called, for those who don't know, it's called the donut of social and planetary boundaries. And let me just explain it very quickly. I was going to show a screenshot, but I thought I'd have it on a stick might be more fun. But this is being developed by the British economist Kate Raworth. It's very well known around the world, used by companies and governments and cities. And it's a donut, the kind of donut that has a hole in the middle. And the inner ring is called the social foundation. These are 12 basic human rights or needs that we try to meet, or based on the sustainable development goals, like food, water, access to energy, healthcare, education. And around the outside is the second circle, the ecological ceiling, made up of 9 planetary boundaries beyond which we cannot go without tipping the Earth into an unstable system. So things like ocean acidification, climate change, biodiversity loss, air pollution, and so on. And this model is very different from a model being about, it's not about model about grow, grow, grow. It's about thriving in balance. It's about bringing people above the social foundation while staying within the ecological ceiling between shortfall and overshoot. And the interesting thing about this model is that it's been adopted by, well, companies, for example, like Unilever or Mars and many others have been using it in their planning, long-term planning, saying, okay, how do we make sure that the products we make, the services we deliver are within that donut-shaped space? But interestingly, also, it's being used by big cities around the world. So, for example, Amsterdam, the city of Amsterdam have adopted that donut model as the basis for its post-COVID recovery program and long-term economic planning. And it's integrated into what they call their circular economy strategy. So they're trying to be low carbon and circular, so low material waste. So by 2030, Amsterdam will have no fossil fuel cars on the streets. They will have be 50% circular by 2030, 100% circular by 2050. But by 2022, they're also going to have 10% of city procurement has to be circular as well. So businesses are being driven right now to get into that donut-shaped space. So I think the big answer to the question, Lawrence, really is about this shift of values away from that idea of growth, 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 growth. And if anybody listening is thinking, I don't like the idea of balance or boundaries, I would just say to you that boundaries are what creates creativity and innovation. Mozart played on a 5-octave piano, Jimi Hendrix on a 6-string guitar, Serena Williams within the tram lines of the tennis court. When Dong Energy decided they were going to go from 85-15 to 15-85, huge constraints, enormous creativity, big struggles, they achieved the aim. So I think boundaries are good for us.
Boundaries are good for us. And another thing boundary does, it creates sort of it pushes the innovations mindset. On last week, Monday, when we kicked off the Jeff, the keynote speaker was Lord Mervyn King, former governor of the Bank of England. And it was kind of funny when we designed the Jeff, the idea we had was, well, let's start with uncertainty and then let's pivot into the future. So the two of you have sort of really complemented one another in terms of, he laid out the urgency around understanding radical uncertainty and talked about how uncertainty also spurs innovation, because sometimes if you don't know, you're forced to try to find out. Well, sometimes when you don't know, the boundaries constrains you and helps you to sort of focus your energy. So I want to talking about long term. I want to talk about debt, and I want to talk about two kinds of debt and get your views. So there is the fiscal debt facing many governments because of COVID-19 and even before. And then what I would call the climate debt, in the sense that if we incur tremendous amount of debt to save the planet, it will be debt. Now, there are those who say that fiscal debt can be fixed. Climate debt cannot be fixed, in the sense that if you don't invest in the climate, the ramifications or the implications are just exponential in terms of that, right? So if you were sitting in that meeting again, going back to President Biden and his 39 other friends, what would you say to them regarding how they should think about the policies around making sure that the debt we're going to incur will be debt that the younger generation would be okay paying, because the debt is going to be created by people who will not be here when it's time to pay the debt, right? So if it's a 30-year debt you're going to incur today, well, if you're not around 30 years from now, maybe you should have the perspective of someone who will be here 30 years from now in the conversation. Coming back to when you talk about the silent majority. So how do we get the notion of, if I'm going to incur debt, let me make sure that I either pay the debt myself or whoever is going to be paying the debt have a voice in what I'm investing in. How do we get the voices of the future in the minds of the leaders of the world as they are about to incur debt, whether it's for COVID or whether it's for fixing the planet?
On the subject of debt, I mean, I've been very influenced by the work of the economist Stephanie Kelton and her book, The Deficit Myth. And, her point there is that when we start thinking about, national debt, fiscal debt, first thing is, don't think about the government's debt being the same as like household debt. Yes, if you go into debt as an individual and you can't pay it back, well, you're in trouble. You might lose your home. Your business might go broke. But that's not how it works with governments. Governments can and do create money. That's how they pay for things. That's how they build stuff. That's how they finance schools and hospitals. So, and that debt doesn't have to be paid off by future generations. The thing to worry about is inflation. In other words, too much debt at a time when when your economy is already overheating. So, of course, you can inject that debt into the system, which is really an investment, when there is productive capacity space. And of course, that's what's happening with COVID, right? Governments around the world, the British government, a center-right government, has been paying people salaries for a year. It's absolutely extraordinary. It just shows what governments can do. And it also shows, in fact, just linking back to this question in Biden, because presumably one of the things they might or might not be discussing is sort of Green New Deal policies. And, if you're going to do something like a Green New Deal, a kind of a climate Marshall Plan, you're going to need a lot of money to, how do you deal with people who are losing jobs in one industry, and they can't exactly directly take the jobs in the next industry. So you need to subsidize that in certain ways. And that we know that can be done because of what we've seen governments do during COVID. But then I think the sort of other thing you're talking about there is the sort of the climate debt. In a way, it's absolutely true that there's this idea if you pick up an economics textbook, you'll find probably in a lot of economics textbooks a chapter on the idea of discounting. The idea that the way that governments and businesses make long-term investment decisions. And what do governments do, for example? They discount the future. They put less weight on the value or the interests or the utility of future generations than present ones. So if you've got a discount rate of 3% and you have an investment project, say a tidal energy power scheme, which has a 100-year time horizon in terms of its benefits, but any benefits after 40 or 50 years are kind of discounted away and not included in the calculations, and that project may not get supported because of the way discounting works. So if I was there with Biden and his pals, one of the things I would be talking about is changing the discounting rules or the discount rates, because again, if you open that economics textbook, it'll say, well, we can discount the lives of future generations or their welfare because we'll have economic growth in the future, which they can benefit from, or there'll be technological gains. But no amount of money in your pocket is going to reverse the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. These are ecological debts which cannot be repaid. And that's why we have to act now. And that's the sort of the kind of paradox, as it were, that the need for long-term thinking is incredibly urgent. We need this long-term investment here and now. We need to incur these so-called debts. But I think young people are okay with this, in the sense that because this is their future that you're investing in, and their future. And otherwise, they are going to be paying for all sorts of climate mitigation and adaptation in the future at a much, every major study of climate change shows the costs of not dealing with it are more expensive than the costs of dealing with it, from the Stern report in the UK to many others.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point regarding young people. And there are different young people live in different parts of the world. They obviously have a different perspective. The ones who live in Europe have a different view of long term than the ones who live in Africa because they're grown under different conditions. I want to move on, Roman, to three or four more topics before we end. I know we have about 15 minutes left. But the next one, I think, is more trying to understand how you think and how you reason, which is not going to be easy. But tell me, how does one train himself to become a public philosopher? What does that term mean? You are a public philosopher. What is that all about?
Well, the term public philosopher is one I kind of, to be honest, invented myself. I heard that in the Netherlands, they have a public position known as the philosopher of the nation, a bit like some countries have a poet laureate. And I love that idea of philosopher of the nation. I mean, the United Kingdom, where I live, does not have that. So I thought my version of it was the idea of a public philosopher, because I'm actually a political scientist by background. And I used to be a business journalist, but I gradually over the years, and though I studied philosophy, I've become interested in not academic philosophy, but how do we answer the big questions about life? How should we live? How should we be good? But what interests me is not just how we do that in our own personal lives or family lives, but how do we do that in the public realm? And that's what a public philosopher for me is. It's asking the question and trying to answer the question of how to live, but how do we do it communally? How do we shift from, for instance, the 20th century focus on individualism to more collective values, which is what we're struggling with today. We're struggling to try and overcome our philosophy of I shop, therefore I am, to something different, which is more collective, more about ideas of, say, intergenerational justice, but which is ultimately, of course, to people's benefit. It's about redefining the common good. And in fact, maybe that's another kind of answer to the question. What I'm interested in is the common good. and recognizing that the common good isn't just my city or my nation or even my planet. It's actually future generations as well. They need to be brought into that realm.
Good. So you mentioned you're being a journalist, so I'm going to go back just quickly to this issue of growth. And I've read several of Václav Smile's book, on growth, and a couple of others who've written about growth. And one of the questions I've always wondered over is, we're growth driven, and yet and still we say we want to create a new economic model for the world, right? So we're talking about the net zero economy, you talk about circular economy, you have all these different models. But what I find intriguing is that all of them are still using the same old calculus, right? So they're using the same old discounting methodologies for investing, they're using the same old accounting practices and investment calculations and what have you. What is it going to take to refocus the emphasis from growth to perhaps maybe sustainability? And if that's the case, what's going to be the metric that we measure the world by in terms of saying company X, person Y is by far more sustainable, and therefore that person deserves better returns, as opposed to company X that shows significant growth because of demand and is always following the consumerism drive of growing demand. How do we refocus our emphasis from growth to say sustainability, or can we do both and maybe call it sustainable growth? How can we achieve sustainable growth if that's something we can do?
So I never use the term sustainable growth, and part of the reason is because I think there's a whole problem with the idea of growth. Nothing in nature grows forever, whether it is the Amazon rainforest or your children's feet. The S curve, a logistic curve, is the core of what nature is all about. Things have healthy phases of growth, and then they level off, and then they may eventually die out. So the idea that we can have any kind of growth which can go on forever doesn't make sense to me. And I think it doesn't make sense in terms of how natural systems work, and I think then that sort of leads to, okay, how do we sort of measure this or think about this? Well, let's just go back for a moment to this little donut diagram, okay, the donut model. Well, this is telling us something about metrics, because this is based on a dashboard of metrics, right? You've got biological or metrics around the outside and social metrics on the inside. All of these things are really well measured, just as well as GDP has been measured since the 1930s, and Kuznets invented GDP. Measures of food security and health access, or temperature rises and so on. And so I think that the way we need to think about measurement, I think the big mistake, and I think this is the mistake I'm seeing in people who are interested in natural capital accounting, which I know is very popular, is to try and reduce, for example, all of these ecological measures into a single financial metric. I'm really against that. I know it's popular, and I know a lot of this is going on, but if you think about it, that's just losing information. That's flattening the data. When you put it all together and you put a price on a forest or a coral reef, when you've actually got the really great biodata, why not just stick with that and embrace the idea of having a dashboard? Look, when you're driving your car, imagine if you just had one indicator for your speed and your fuel and the revs per minute and everything. No, we don't want one indicator. We want a dashboard, right? So I think that's where we need to move towards.
Yeah, well, so let me.
I don't know. What do you think? What's your view?
I'm about to push back right now. So let me push back a little bit, Roman, what you just said, because I will push back because there are those who will say, "Oh my goodness, Roman, that's too complicated. I don't need a dashboard. I just need a simple single digit to tell me, something that will let me make my decision. I don't need a sort of an array of metrics." So it boils down to people being able to go from the complex, which is, you might say, the donut economics, that little thing you showed is very complex. I understand from a systems thinking perspective. I'm with you. I love what you just showed. In fact, one of my goals is to get the author of that book to visit EEI and talk about the book, because I think the model will be very helpful for the industry. But isn't an issue here coming back to this idea of what you're suggesting is more information to make the right decision that will lead to greater resilience, perhaps, but someone would say, I'm a short-term thinking kind of person. I'm all interested in now. So isn't it back to the same problem that give a full picture of reality, which means thinking long-term, is something that we have been ill prepared for as a society. And we need to go back to start saying, you know what? It's not enough to show me the GDP. But guess what? At the end of every month, all of the major financial institutions, what they do, they put out GDP. So you're advocating for a different set of metrics to guide society. How do we get them to do that? How do we get them to agree for this new set of metrics to guide society?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is governments around the world are already doing it. I mean, you can see, there's the Wellbeing Economy Alliance of governments, New Zealand, Iceland, Scotland, who are trying to use different sets of metrics, well-being metrics, dashboards of metrics. Bhutan has its happiness index. I'm not a great fan of that. But the point, though, is that GDP, is dying. And I think most of us know that. I mean, there's not most of us, but I'd say there's a clear shift going on away from GDP. Even the inventor of GDP, Kuznets, knew that it was full of holes and problems and all sorts of things. All the things that aren't measured, whether it's, domestic work in the household, or the fact that GDP goes up when there's a traffic accident because of all the insurance claims and so on. There's more money generated by fatalities. It's madness, right? But every set of measures has its problems. Some measures are too simple. Yes, some measures are too complex too. And I think maybe, there are contexts where maybe the donut looks too complex and people will want to draw on something simpler, like an ecological footprint measure. And those are all available. Those are around. And so I think we're in let's say a conversational space at the moment about trying to create new metrics and reach a kind of consensus, because clearly you need consensus for cross-country comparisons. But I would say, look, let's embrace the complexity. I mean, everything's complex, but this is also very simple too. It's like, okay, we need to learn to live on the one planet we know that sustains life. You can't, this is the basis of ecological economics. You can't keep using resources faster than they can be naturally regenerated, and you can't create wastes faster than they can be naturally absorbed. And if you want to find a way of measuring that, staying in balance, well, let's look at the metrics that are out there. Let's go for that. So I think GDP is always going to have a place. I think monetary metrics do, because they do relate to something real in life. About one of the things that incentivizes people is material wealth, and incentivizes governments and businesses, but that is shifting. You just think of the growth of the B Corporation movement, the benefit corporation, big companies, Ben and Jerry's, Natura, massive companies are embracing triple bottom line accounting. They are changing their charters so that they're reporting on finance as well as environmental targets, as well as social targets. Well, that's not much more complex than the donut model, I don't think. It's just multiple metrics, and it makes decision making a bit harder, but let's go for it. So I'm sure we can have a much longer conversation about this one day.
Well, we can, and we got 5 minutes. I want to wrap up here because I know we have a panel coming after this, but I want to just bring up the developing world. Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia, they could actually leapfrog to what you're suggesting, right? They could actually leapfrog to models that are much more data rich, because obviously they don't have the same legacy systems. And so talking about leapfrogging and talking about different cultures and countries, do you think OECD countries, mainly the Western countries, have lost the love of long-term thinking compared to, say, countries in Asia and parts of the emerging economies? Do you think we need to sort of revisit that in the West?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, because I think we have this image of certain kinds of societies are more culturally oriented towards the long term. So people think, I wish we could just be more like China, people tell me, think of their long-term investment in green infrastructure. Or I wish we could be more like Singapore, which might be short on political liberties, but is good on long-term investment in healthcare and education, and is catching up when it comes to climate now, finally. But of course, there's all sorts of short-termism in different countries too, determined by political systems and colonial heritage and many different things like that. But I certainly think there is a potential for leapfrogging that we do see. I mean, look at the expansion of solar in Bangladesh, microgrids. There's been swarm electrification, as the World Bank called it, across Bangladesh. In rural villages, people putting up solar panels, and then there's I think I might be wrong about this, but I think there are now something like 10,000 microgrid networks in Bangladesh. So, local villagers selling their excess to their neighbors into the next village. I mean, it's an amazing shift in peer-to-peer electrification, and that is helping them leapfrog, the dirty industrial revolution, as it were. And so I think there's a lot of potential there, but I equally think the OECD countries, they could be learning a lot from long-term policy processes that happen in other places, like Singapore, for example. They've got a sort of a futures department inside the Prime Minister's office, right? And I mean, so they do a lot of long-term strategic thinking. It's really good. I recently had a very interesting conversation with, in the United Arab Emirates, I was speaking to the Minister for the Future. They have a Minister for the Future, a dedicated position, who's in charge of the UAE's 50-year development plan. Now, not a developing country, certainly, but one that's struggling to move off the fossil fuel legacy, though they've still got 300 years of oil in the ground. But they're being very innovative about how they can become a climate technology exporter, for example, how they can think beyond the next 10 years, think half a century in advance. So I think there's a lot of learning to be doing that the OECD could be doing from many different countries around the world.
So I've been lucky enough to get the control room to give me 2 more minutes. So I'm gonna use those 2 minutes very, very wisely here. So quickly, the path of the good ancestor. So now let's give the audience, give the listeners the 4 ways, I believe you talk about in the book, that will put you on the path to being a good ancestor. What are those? Can you just give us a quick summary of those pathways to becoming a good ancestor?
Well, I think one thing one needs to do is certainly consider one's legacy, a legacy mindset, and asking yourself, how am I going to be judged by those generations to come? I think the second thing to think about is intergenerational justice, which is what obligations we have to those future generations, because we know that we are impacting on their lives. I'd say the third thing we talked about was cathedral thinking. Engage in planning processes that go beyond your own career, beyond your own lifetime. And I'd say fourthly, and this is a more philosophical one, is the idea of deep time, recognizing that, look, humankind is just an eye blink in the cosmic story. We've been around for a couple of 100,000 years, look, and that's nothing in the age. If the age of the Earth was a distance from your nose to the tip of your outstretched hand, one stroke of a nail file on your middle finger erases human history. Yet in 200 years, we've done untold damage to the living world. We know that. It cannot continue. The energy sector, the concrete industry, so many parts of our economies have roles to play in taking us out of that history into a longer one that our future generations can be truly proud of.
Well, Roman, thank you so much. The Good Ancestor is the book. I look forward to meeting you in person the next time I come to London after COVID is done, and we can go out and have a beer or a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or a spot of tea, like my wife would always say, and we can then keep our conversation going. Thank you so much for joining us at EEI, and we look forward to seeing you when you have the next book out, hopefully soon.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roman and Lawrence, for such a thought-provoking conversation. You gave a lot of examples of long-term thinking and how we can be more empathetic as we plan not only for the energy systems of 2050, but for what our societies will be like in the future. If you'd like to learn more strategies for thinking long-term in this short-term world, we invite you to check out Roman's latest book, The Good Ancestor. You can find his book and those of other authors who are speaking at the Jeff by visiting our Destination 2050 bookstore in the Expo area.